Hello and welcome, I'm Tafara Gadamu. With South Sudan finally ratifying the Cooperative Framework Agreement that covers the rights and obligations for the development of water resources in the Nile Basin is now ready to enter into force. But what next? My guest, Ambassador Ibrahim Idris, was involved in the process for at least 2 decades. Very well, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
So this is a process that you've been involved in for the last how many years? 2 decades at the very least?
Over 2 decades.
So when you say over 2 decades, the seeds for this Cooperative Framework Agreement were basically sown in the late 1990s, that far back?
Almost end of 1990s. That was...
when the Nile Basin Initiative was
established. It was in 1999. The Nile Basin Initiative was established, and then... Because when Ethiopia joined this process, because prior to 1990, which is the establishment of the Nile Basin Initiative, there were other groupings which were sponsored by Egypt, because they were not actually involved in the actual curing, the disease that prevailed in the region, which is inequality. In the use of the Nile water. So Ethiopia only participated as observer in the previous, when it came and the 1999 initiative was established. One of the issue was to address was the inequality of the equal use of the Nile, of the water within the basin. That's why Ethiopia joined the Nile Basin Initiative. In fact, we could say it was Ethiopian initiative,
that brought it. But it was a very rocky start, right?
Exactly. It was very difficult at the beginning because the Egyptians and the Sudanese wanted to continue only in their superficial activities, the previous gatherings. And then they were...
Of course, invoking the 1959...
1929. In fact, Egypt wanted, to continue these treaties being in force. 1929 was between Britain, representing the upstream colonial colonies, and then on one hand, and then Egypt on the other hand. This was in 1929. In fact, it was an exchange of note. It's an exchange of note, which was signed in Egypt between the Egyptian authorities and the English colonial authorities.
And then came the 1959, which was slightly revised.
Because there was a change. Egypt, Sudan became independent in 1956. So now they started to question as to the legality of the 1929, because at least for them it was also a colonial arrangement, 1929. So there was a problem between Sudan and Egypt. So the Egyptians, there were protests from the scholars, within Sudan against the treaty. So in fact, there was also a position taken by the Sudanese authorities, challenging the 1929. So the Egyptians had to negotiate with the new government which they installed. And then 1959 treaty was signed, and then based on that you have the Aswan Dam built.
They built, and both parties were standing their ground
Yes.
in enforcing these treaties.
Exactly.
Which basically did not consider the interests of other riparian countries, more so Ethiopia, which is a major contributor to the Nile River.
In fact, when they signed, the 1959 treaty, they raised their share of the resources.
That's very true. That's very true.
Under 1929 treaty, the Egyptian share was about 18 point something.
So that's why I said it's revised and brought
they
that to...
revised it, and then they raised their share. Egypt getting 55.5 billion cubic meters, and Sudan 18.5 billion cubic meter, and then there was remaining 10 for evaporation, and no share for Ethiopia and no share for riparian countries.
So it's against this background that the cooperative framework was put in place. What does it doesn't apportion figures, right?
No.
it basically looks into the equitable and fair share used by the riparian countries of this water.
In fact,
what is it essentially, this cooperative framework?
The cooperative, in fact, it undermines, it does away with the previous agreements concluded.
That's automatic.
Automatic, because we have now a new arrangement. So this is a new beginning, for the countries in the basin. They're going to share the water on equitable and reasonable, not in liters sharing, but also on how to cooperatively utilize the Nile water resources.
Having that conversation going on among themselves.
Yes.
So when this was initiated right from the very beginning, not everybody was happy with all this framework, right?
Exactly.
Some were into it head on, others had reservations.
Exactly. In fact, in the beginning, when the negotiation started, since I was involved, the dispute, the controversy was those countries at loggerhead were Egypt and Sudan on one hand and Ethiopia on the other hand. By and large, the upstream countries were observing very closely. So we continued, this process continued for about 5 years. In fact, it continued until we had the meeting in Kinshasa, Minister of Council Ministers of Waters in Kinshasa, and the figure changed.
In what sense?
Now, the riparian countries, about 6 of them sided with Ethiopia because they understood the Ethiopian argument that the intention of Egypt and Sudan was to prolong the continuity of the 1959, the status quo based on the 1959. So after the Kinshasa meeting, now we have 2 countries, the downstream countries on one side, and Ethiopia and the upstream countries, the 6 upstream countries on the other side. So this is how it ended in 2010 in the meeting of Sharm el-Sheikh, where we are separated.
That was clearly marked.
Yeah, exactly. That was the Nile meeting. The last Nile meeting was in Sharm el-Sheikh, yes, in 2010.
And what followed after that? Definitely they started signing, right?
Yeah. In Sharm el-Sheikh agreement, the 7 countries, they gave 1 year for Egypt and Sudan to be ready, to join. And then in 1910, again in 1910, they agreed they want to give 1 year. After 1 year, this is a period for clearing, the text, and then convening in Entebbe for the signing process of.
How many countries signed in Entebbe? That was a landmark, right?
4 countries signed, yes.
Ratification was to come later.
Later, exactly.
So these 4 countries signed, and what does the others say?
And then the others, Burundi and Kenya, and they followed. Now there were 6 countries, and then again DRC
was playing the waiting game.
Exactly, also signed, and except Sudan and Egypt.
I mean, Sudan and Egypt were playing the waiting game to see if this works or not.
Sudan was ambivalent, because they don't want to provoke Egypt because they were under full control, or I can say under the pressure of Egypt, but
later in the conversation they threw their weight behind Ethiopia.
Exactly.
All up until
even around 1911, I think 1913, the 2 countries they first withdrew from the NBI. And then Sudan came back.
And then became a very strong.
And then started to strengthen its relation with Ethiopia, including during the construction of the Ethiopian Renaissance Dam.
Unlike in the previous years.
Exactly.
So, what does ratification entail?
Ratification means the document is now in force. Now that there is enough ground, strong ground, for the 6 countries to come together and create and establish the commission.
So South Sudan came in last. Tell me about that story. What was involved in the process of encouraging South Sudan to join the bandwagon and ratify the agreement? I mean, there must have been plenty stories out there, most of them complicated, of course.
In the post 2011, there was an attempt by Egypt, to create an obstacle, and convince the upstream countries not to those who signed to withdraw, or those who ratified to withdraw, and those who didn't sign not to sign. They were engaged in a very tense diplomatic campaign. And in spite of this, however, including Ethiopia, prior to South Sudan, ratifying, there were 5 countries. They insisted on their position, one. And then lastly, it was South Sudan, which was very important landmark in the establishment of in the CFA coming into effect, for 2 reasons. One, South Sudan is the last country out of the 6th country which gave the position when the document, the CFA, would come into effect. This is one. And the other is that South Sudan is part of the Sudan, which was party to 1959 treaty. Because by signing the CFA or acceding to the CFA, this is a blow to 1959 treaty, because it's now South Sudan played a very important role in this convention, CFA coming into effect. So it's a very important role, although in spite of the fact that the Egyptians, pressured against, Sudan not signing this, but
pressure, meaning what kind of pressure?
For trying, to convince them, in different ways. And then because, the threat that Egyptians had been displaying against Ethiopia, this also an indication that it could apply, to other riparian countries. In spite of all these obstacles, South Sudan took a bold measure in acceding, to the convention.
There are still 4 countries. There's Sudan and there's also Egypt, which have not signed, right? But there is also Kenya, which has not ratified the treaty, and also the Democratic Republic, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. What does this mean to the whole process?
Well,
particularly these 2 countries, the last 2 countries, Kenya and DRC.
Because this is the best alternative for the upstream countries to be able to make use of their resources and cooperate in the development and of these joint common resources. And
So, are you saying that they don't recognize that this is important for them?
Kenyans, they do also recognize, because we have been in contact with the experts, and they are all interested, in this process, in the being come to a successful end. And because now it gives them an opportunity, for DRC and Kenya. I'm sure they will join this process very.
I hope so. But what is the rationale that they have adopted not to ratify the agreement? Why didn't ratify the agreement now? Do you know? Can you guess?
I cannot tell from, in fact, as to the reason, but maybe it's a process in the ratification process, discussion, consultation within their administration. But at the end of the day, now there is a green light. We have now a commission. Now 6 countries determined to establish the commission. Then, because cooperation is very important. For cooperation, you need a framework agreement. And this is the right opportunity. And that's why I argue that there is a strong possibility that Kenya and DRC will join because we are now going to exploit the water in cooperative way.
So this framework agreement would come into effect 2 months from the day the last
ratification by South Sudan.
That means before the end of this year. That's about 2 weeks before the end of the year. So what does it mean when it comes into effect? What does this mean in light of these 4 countries which are not part of this whole process? Not the whole process, but about this structure.
I think they have no other alternative.
I'm sure they don't have any other alternative, but with them absent from this conversation, how do you visualize the framework agreement taking shape?
Well,
of course it's binding, but you need consensus, you need conversation.
Because under the convention, Article 43 of the framework agreement, 6 countries minimum is enough for the Commission to come into effect. Then it means the Commission is established, and then the Commission will start, once it's established by the member countries who ratified the convention, then the convention will start operating. And there are establishing institutions, establishing committees, organizing, its offices. So this is already we have now in the process. And then...
but wouldn't that process be a little bit too bumpy without the 4 countries being party to this?
Yeah, you're right. I don't think there is a problem as far as Kenya and DRC is concerned. But the problem could be with Egypt and Sudan.
Don't the Egyptians have legitimate concern here?
Even if they have, because they themselves insisted on the bilateral treaty that they concluded with Sudan as binding on other countries when they didn't have also, they were not source of the Nile water.
But they know that the 1959 thing is over. It's done away with. Exactly. That's for sure. But beyond that, don't they have a legitimate concern over the use of the water resources? Because there is almost...
Egypt and Sudan were in the process. They have been, until 2010, they were in the process. In fact, Article 43, which provides of the minimum ratification for coming of the instrument to come into effect, they were there. They have approved it. There is no problem as to that on the part of Sudan or Egypt, because the issue that they brought into based on which they raised their protest was other issues like water security, which is not attached to this principle of the conference of the instrument coming into effect.
But certainly, that's certainly strongly related to what they think is a factor here, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dome.
In the first place, Ethiopia does have, a right in the Nile water because it contributes more than 85% of the water. So it has a right. The Renaissance Dam is an expression of the right of its equitable share in the use of the Nile water. So there is no problem. In fact, Ethiopia, even Sudan accepts, that Ethiopia has a right, of the dam.
So what do you see happening in the next, 10 years as this framework agreement comes into effect?
The framework agreement is a document. It's an institution, and it's a document which, based on which the Commission will be established. And the Commission will be established by the minimum of these 6 countries. And then the downstream countries have no other alternative than to be part of this process, because we are calling for, the instrument is calling, or the CFA is calling for cooperation, for equitable use of the Nile water, and no significant harm, causing no significant harm. So if Sudan and Egypt join the process, that's good. If they don't join it, then it will not have effect on the Commission or the CFA.
But they're going to be affected by what happens as part of this process, right?
Yes. but they have no alternative if they want to join, because it's only through cooperation that Sudan and Egypt could benefit. If there is no cooperation, what does that mean? It means, every country will go its own unilateral measures. And that is not desired either by the downstream Egypt and Sudan. So it's at least a minimum, because international agreements in relation to basins, basins, the agreements are more in the interest of the downstream countries, because
yes, both Egypt and Sudan.
So they have to come closer to the process and join the process, and then be part of the process, so that they could at least defend their interest being part of the process.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
I also thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Ana pana